Hello, everybody. Welcome to This Week in Global Development. My name's David Ainsworth. I'm the business editor here at Devex. We've got a packed discussion for you as normal. I'm joined by Jesse Chase-Lubitz, our global development reporter, and Rumi Kachamba, our senior editor. And this week we're going to be talking a little bit about what's just happened at WHA, what's happening right now in Gaza, and what's going to be happening next month at the Finance for Development Summit in Seville. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lovely. Right, Rumi, let's kick off with you. We're going to have a little bit of an episode in two parts here because I think Rumi knows rather more about what's happening at WHA and Jesse knows rather more about the other subjects. So, yeah, Rumi, let's kick off with you. So tell me about tell me the big news from WHA. What were the key things that happened?
I guess the biggest news would be the pandemic treaty, mainly because countries have been negotiating this treaty for the last 3 years. So after COVID-19 happened, people were of the belief that we did things wrong and we need to work out a way that countries can be able to access commodities equally and work out a way that information on pathogens or information on anything that could cause a pandemic can be passed on in a timely manner. So that was the whole premise behind the pandemic treaty. And this year it was actually adopted by the World Health Assembly, and which was big news because we're expecting them to adopt it last year. They couldn't come to an agreement last year. So it finally happened this year. But there's a lot of buts as usual with the UN process. There's one part of the treaty that they failed to actually agree on. This is a treaty on something called pathogen access and benefit sharing. And it's basically something that describes how countries are supposed to share information on pathogens, which cause pandemics and diseases. And once they share that information, companies usually use it to develop like treatments or vaccines, and countries are asking for benefits from that. If you develop a vaccine using information that we've shared, then that means that we should probably get some share of the proceeds. So countries actually failed to come to an agreement on this, mainly because low-income countries who were last in line to get COVID-19 vaccines were asking for a specific percentage, 20%. And high-income countries who host probably most of the pharmaceutical companies were pushing back on that. So they're going to take another year to negotiate on this, and it'll be an annex to the agreement. Once that annex is agreed upon, then countries can actually start ratifying the treaty. And unfortunately, it takes 60 countries to ratify the treaty in order for it to come in force. So adopted, but we're still a long way from actually having something that's enforceable.
Okay, there's still a lot of progress. And everyone was kind of anticipating that the United States might get in the way of this a little bit, but actually they kind of got themselves out of the way by refusing to
So
take part at all.
yeah, the United States did not show up to this year's World Health Assembly. There was actually a lot of debate about whether or not we'd see the United States at the World Health Assembly. They've actually attended some previous WHO Executive Board meetings, and this year they did not attend the World Health Assembly at all. The United States was really invested in the negotiations. I don't know if I would say that they held the negotiations back, but they were really invested in the negotiations. There were certain things that they needed to come out of the treaty. First of all, I think one of the big sticking points was what kind of agreement would it be? Would it be a treaty? And what implications does that have in the US? So all those issues were not really up for discussion this year because they weren't participating in the negotiations anymore. One of the things that Donald Trump did was he withdrew them from the negotiations. But interesting enough, there was no U.S. contingent at WHA, but they did send in a video with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. telling member states that we need to do something better. Let's leave the WHO. Let's focus on other institutions or set up more institutions, which was a very interesting moment at WHA.
Yeah, I'd imagine that didn't go down brilliantly. Um,
So I actually asked a few people from WHO, I'm like, you played this video. They're like, it's a member state organization. They're still a member state. They say they want to leave, but they're still a member state. So they have every right to say what it is they want to say. But yeah, and actually, one country has actually agreed with the United States. Argentina is also on its way out or trying to get out of the WHO as well. They announced soon after Donald Trump announced that he's pulling the US out of the WHO. They also announced that they intend on leaving the WHO, and apparently sent a letter to the United States headquarters in New York, asking to leave, but there is no way to actually leave the WHO. The constitution actually doesn't set out any way for countries to leave. I suppose when the organization was started, no one imagined that people would want to leave. So now, the executive board has to discuss this in January, figure out what they need to do with Argentina, and then WHA next year will then discuss what to do with Argentina. So I guess Argentina is stuck for the meantime.
So, how come Argentina's stuck and the United States isn't? Or
Because
is it?
The United States has it in their constitution that they can leave the WHO as long as they give 1 year's notice. It's debatable whether or not they've given 1 year's notice, but they have it. Argentina does not. So Argentina is asking to be released.
I see. Not a
But they're
strong
still to
message, is it?
discuss that they're also going to discuss the US's exit as well, because the US is actually owing, or I guess they might question that. The US did not pay its assessed contributions, which are mandatory fees for 2024 and 2025. So by the time they announced that they're leaving in 2025, they hadn't paid their assessed contributions for the previous year, and they haven't paid assessed contributions for now. So this now actually depends on when exactly they're leaving. The way it was worded is that they are leaving. Donald Trump had announced that he's leaving in his previous term, and he worded it in such a way that they're continuing with that announcement. If it's new announcement, it means they're supposed to give a year, meaning that they're owing fees for 2024 and 2025. So that's something that the WHO still also has to discuss next year.
Okay. So all of
Yeah.
this has a pretty radical effect on the WHO budget, which was the other major topic that was under discussion this year. So there, things went a little better than expected, but still extremely badly was my kind of understanding of it. But maybe you can fill us in on some more of those details.
100%. So the WHO was asking member states to increase their mandatory fees. Basically, they need more money and they also need more flexible money. The WHO gets money in two ways: assessed contributions, which is mandatory fees from each member states, as well as voluntary contributions. Now, the voluntary contributions are usually pegged to something, or pegged to a particular program. So a country can come and say, I'm giving this amount of money and it's for HIV. But what they need more of is flexible funding, money that they can use in whatever way they see fit. So they needed an increase in assessed contribution, and member states had actually agreed to this already, but it was now timing. Can they increase it for a second time this year? And right at the beginning of WHA, which was on Tuesday, they actually got this approval for member states to increase their contributions by 20%. It sounds good, but unfortunately, because the US was probably the country that paid the most in assessed contributions, it still leaves them with a deficit. So as of the last WHA, when you look at assessed contributions, all the work that they've been doing to raise money, as well as like the voluntary contributions that they have, WHO's chief Tedros announced that they had 60% of their budget for the next year.
Well, and he kind of put a positive spin on that, saying, well, this is more than we had last year, but it still doesn't seem like the greatest situation to be in.
It doesn't seem like the greatest situation to be in, because you struggle to figure out where the rest of the money would come from. It might be more than they had the last year, but then a lot of the countries who you'd expect would make a pledge did that. Sweden, Switzerland, China. China announced that it'll be pledging an extra 500 million over 5 years. And so a lot of the countries who you're expecting to pledge have already done so. We also had like smaller countries like Tanzania doubling their pledges. So you struggle to see where the rest of the money would come from.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Moving on then, since Jesse, you've been waiting patiently. Busy week for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, this new organization that's supposed to be kind of in charge of delivering humanitarian aid in Gaza. Why don't you run us through the details of what's been happening there?
Yeah, so I'll give you a little background because I think it's kind of a confusing one to understand. So the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was established in February of this year, so it's a pretty new organization, and it was established by a bunch of U.S. intelligence officials and defense officials and business executives, and it has a lot of U.S. and Israeli backing. And the difference between this foundation and other aid foundations is that it was meant to bring aid to Gaza while addressing concerns that the Israeli government had that aid was being diverted by Hamas. They also said that they would address the quote unquote failures of the traditional UN system. So they were really kind of putting themselves at odds with the traditional humanitarian systems. The way that this is meant to work is that they set up these big so-called secure distribution centers around Gaza, and the citizens there would have to kind of come in, bring some kind of document proving their identity in order to get any aid. And the centers are also supposed to be guarded by these like armed private contractors. From the start, humanitarian groups have been very against this, saying it sets a dangerous precedent. Normally aid is not guarded by security, and you don't have to prove your identity in order to get food. So that's sort of the background. There was always a bit of controversy here. This week, we had a few different things happen. First, on Sunday, on May 25th, Jake Wood, the executive director, who's a former U.S. Marine, he stepped down from his position, saying it was not possible to implement the initiative while also adhering strictly to humanitarian principles. So this was like a big moment where, suddenly the founder, the director, has said, like, this isn't going to work. And this is one day before the organization was set to open its first distribution center in Rafah in Gaza. So he steps down. The next day, they do proceed opening their first, I think maybe one or two distribution centers. As far as I understand, no one really went because everyone was really confused. But then on Tuesday, now we've started to see people showing up. But also we saw that Wood had actually sent a letter a few days earlier on May 22nd, before he resigned, to the coordinating body in Israel, implying that a bunch of the big NGOs like, Mercy Corps, Save the Children, were all kind of on board with this and had agreed to help distribute the aid. But it turns out that none of them had actually agreed to this. They did get on a call with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation just to kind of learn about what their plan was. But most of them sent us comments or published comments saying, we never agreed to this. We are not associated with GHF at all. Just to name the ones who actually said this, was Save the Children, Mercy Corps, Care International, and Project Hope all said this publicly. So that's kind of where we are today. Now there are people in Gaza going to these distribution centers, and we're hearing a lot of mixed reports about how that's unfolding. Apparently, yesterday there were just so many people there kind of waiting in these very secure, like fenced lines, almost like a checkpoint. And there were some reports that they started like storming the facility. I don't know exactly how to define storming, or we're getting different people saying different things, but so far it's a bit chaotic.
Okay. All right. So do they actually have, like, I must confess I'm still trying to understand this story myself. Like, how much aid do they actually have to distribute? Where is it coming from? Who's doing the distribution?
I mean, it's fair. They said that they distributed, I have to get the number, but they said that they were able to distribute a lot of food. But I don't know exactly where it's coming from. I think it's all US and Israeli backed, so I'm guessing, it's funded through the US organization. But I mean, as far as I understand it, all of these organizations have like trucks on the border of Gaza that are just not being let in. I don't think that the struggle here is finding the aid. It's getting the aid over the border, which they've now managed to do by adhering to these guidelines.
Okay. All right. So this kind of sets a pretty dangerous precedent. This is kind of asking people to come and camp in secure facilities in exchange for food. It kind of smacks a little bit of one quote in the Washington Post, I think, said concentration camps. This is how are humanitarian organizations responding to this? I know that the United Nations has also been critical of this.
Yeah. So the Washington Post article had it wasn't in response to this most recent update. It was in response to a planning document by GHF that had been released earlier. And they specifically referenced concentration camps because part of the plan was that these distribution centers would eventually require people to live within these like massive facilities, which is not happening right now, but that was on the planning document. In order to access food, they'd have to live within this space. And they had said, we should come up, like people may compare this to a concentration camp. And so we should come up with wording to respond should that happen, just to put that in full context. But yeah, I think the NGOs, the UN, I mean, they're saying exactly what you said. This sets a dangerous precedent. They do things the way they do them for a reason. They have, they typically go directly to communities. They don't make people prove their identity in order to get food and aid. I mean, just on a logistical level, like these people don't have any access to their homes. How do they have papers? Or like, I'm sure many of them do, but like, that's probably a hurdle. And so I think it will be interesting to see like if it works, what does this mean long term for those aid organizations who are all saying we can't do it this way? We'll have to wait and see kind of which direction that goes in.
Okay, I think this seems like a story where we'll very much have to wait and see what. Like, fundamentally, there are existing organizations whose job it is to give out aid in Gaza, and those have been sidelined by the Israeli authorities and with some support from the United States. It seems like an extremely sensitive area for anybody to get involved in. So many kind of complexities to it. And this new organization seems to have got off to a pretty inauspicious start.
Yeah, it's not looking good. I also think it's worth noting that in order to just get food into the country, you had to have Israel and the US behind it, when normally aid works outside of those political boundaries. And so, outside of just the sort of security element, the militarization element, the proving your identity element, you're also in a situation where, like, in order for aid to function, it has to be approved of by these political powers on the outside. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think I have practical questions about how all of this is going to work, which I don't think we're necessarily in a position to answer here. And I think there are a number of questions about the kind of political environment that surrounds this organization and whether it should exist. And those two, I think we're going to have to pay attention to moving forward. And I think we're going to be writing quite a lot more about this
Yes, definitely.
strange new organization and kind of where it goes next. For now, let's move on. Let's stick with you, Jesse, just for now, and talk about the big news that's coming up in the next month, which is the Finance for Development Conference, which is taking place in Seville. And this has kind of it's potentially gone under the radar a little bit because of all of the chaos in the United States and the cuts and everything like that. But it is an extremely significant kind of moment in the kind of international development calendar, because this is where a lot of decisions are going to be made. So tell us a bit more about what this conference is and kind of what's on the agenda there.
Yeah. So it has, I mean, I agree it's gone under the radar to some degree, but at the same time, I'm hearing about it constantly. Like everyone is going to this meeting. And I think part of the reason for that is it happens once every decade. So the last time we had a financing for development conference was in 2015. Before that was 2008, and then the first one was in 2000. So we're only on the fourth one of this conference. And there's really not that many that I can think of that happen so far apart. The idea of financing for development is to kind of reflect the period that the world is in, and what that means for development. So it's sort of like a norm-setting conference. It's not meant to be legally binding, but it is meant to have a really big political influence and sort of define how we're all going to agree on moving forward with development in the years to come in the next decade. So I think the sidelines of this are going to be really important. Everyone's going to be there. You're going to have the IFIs and the MDBs, and private companies are going to be there as well, and NGOs. And so I think the main things to watch for is like, what is everybody talking about? Not necessarily what has everyone agreed on. So I mean, I can go through sort of the main themes that we're expecting to hear and what's likely to be contentious. So the first one would probably be on debt. It's obviously a lot of countries are in serious debt crises right now. There's been a lot of low to middle income countries saying we need to change the way that debt is restructured. Right now, it happens under the G20 common framework. And many say that it's very slow and opaque and widely kind of disliked. And so we need to find a new way to do debt restructuring. Um, this is probably going to be a contentious issue. The US is generally kind of retreating from global leadership, and it's unlikely to support, moving all of debt restructuring to a different body or doing it entirely differently. But we can kind of come back to what the US's role will be at the end. Um, Another thing is going to just be like general ODA cuts, what's available for ODA, whether we're going to see new coalitions form, with different countries taking the lead now that the US has reduced its foreign development assistance and the EU is also doing the same. Will we see more leadership coming out of the Middle East or Gulf countries? It's hard to tell right now, but like I said, everyone's going to be there, and so it's a really interesting time to see who's talking to who and what conversations are going on. Um, yeah, trade is another big one. It's obviously a huge, way for low income countries to get income especially when you don't have ODA. And now we've got some serious trade tensions going on. So you're going to see low income countries pushing for a big boost there. But again, a lot of pushback from the US. Um, yeah, domestic resource mobilization, which has kind of always been a topic at these meetings, is basically like how can low income countries work on, increasing taxes or harnessing their own critical minerals better in order to benefit from what they have. I don't know how contentious that will be. I'm guessing conversations will just kind of be ongoing there. Um, the same kind of goes for private investment. This whole kind of billions to trillions idea that the World Bank proposed first emerged at 2015 at Financing for Development. We're likely to see very similar conversations happen where, we have to use private investment, we have to leverage it. I don't know that it's going to be anything wildly new and creative, but it's going to continue to be extremely important. And then the final thing is taxes. A lot of low-income countries have been trying to get the Global Tax Convention under the UN rather than under the OECD, which is largely led by wealthy countries. They've actually made quite a lot of progress on that since 2015 when they first proposed this. And so we could see this kind of moment in Seville where you have some kind of decision, but I'm not sure this will be contentious because it's been going on for the last 10 years. So yeah, I'll stop there for now. Those are sort of some of the long-ish list of hot topics.
Yeah, it's interesting to try and understand how many of these we actually expect to see some progress on here. I mean, the debt discussions have been happening for ages. The can keeps getting kicked down the road. The high income nations are not apparently very interested in tackling this issue. They don't seem to care. And the question really becomes like where are the pressure points? How can you actually get people to deal with this? But this again is a group of people coming together. The Prime Minister of Spain, I think, is going to be there. Obviously, he's going to be highly incentivized to kind of twist the arm of his G20 colleagues to actually promise to do something so that Spain doesn't look bad. There might be an opportunity there. The tax convention seems to be something where there may actually be space for progress. This has been progressing for a long time. A lot of people want it. It's not clear to me at all at this stage which of these topics we can actually expect to see significant progress on. Although I think if I were a betting man, I would bet that we're not going to see any progress on domestic resource mobilization. We're not going to see any progress on billions to trillions because those require people in the private sector to actually commit their own money or for us to find a way to get them to commit their money. And I think they've said again and again and again that they're not very interested in doing it. There are plenty of ways to make money already. Thank you very much. Without investing in lower middle income countries, in unfamiliar markets, in something that you don't really understand. And then I think we'll stick with the United States stock market. Thank you very much. We'll keep our billions and our trillions where we know where we can easily lay our hands on them. So I'm pretty confident we're not going to see any progress on those. But
You might be right. It's important to point out that there's something called the International Business Forum that's happening at the same time. It's really an essential part of FFD, and so there's really big names that are going to be walking around Sevilla. And so I do think it opens the opportunity for productive conversations to happen. But I also kind of feel like the point of this is not to come out with an agreement. The point of FFD is to say like, okay, this is what we're dealing with for the next decade, rather than to say we've now agreed on a new framework for debt restructuring. And so I don't, even if, the final outcome document feels a little bit all over the place, I'm not sure we'll be able to measure the success of this for a little while. We'll have to see what conversations actually happened and what kind of smaller agreements were developed on the sidelines. Overall, we might not have any big exciting headlines, but I think if we dig a little bit, there could be some interesting things going on.
Would you say that the current moment or current climate is pushing the conversation a little bit forward? Because we actually have a story out today. A lot of conversations at WHA were about domestic financing for health initiatives. And the question behind it is, how can countries actually do this, low and middle income countries, when they have to deal with huge debt payments and there's nothing left after that? So do you think the current climate could actually push the conversation forward?
I definitely think so. I mean, I think the Africa group is going to be there. I think there's a lot of really strong voices there on a solution to debt. And yeah, like we are in a moment of crisis where like there aren't going to be any other options, especially with like potentially increased tariffs and everything. The important thing to note here is normally FFD is supposed to end in consensus. This year, it is very unlikely to do that. If consensus can't be reached, some sort of agreement is reached by vote. And the U.S. has made it very clear that they're not going to participate in an outcome document. So in a similar way to kind of what we saw at WHA, we might, the U.S. sort of removing itself from the conversation a little bit might leave room open for other solutions to be found without them. But it's hard to know at this point.
it does seem like certainly a possibility that we're in a situation where the United States so actively removing itself from conversations around health, around debt, or around other things, is creating an opportunity for other leaders to come together and say, okay, well, never mind you then, we'll agree something. And when you're willing to come back and talk to us again like grown-ups, then we'll let you know what we've decided. And trying to have that conversation, obviously, without a quarter of the world economy in the room is problematic, because they may come back and say, well, we're just not going to do this. And it's not clear how much capacity the rest of the world has to twist the arm of the United States and get it to do anything at all.
I was gonna highlight that I think everyone would want to do that, to say, hey, we're gonna continue this on our own. And you're seeing a lot of that. Like, I think a lot of countries are stepping up and showing support for WHO. But then you also have to admit just the sheer economic force that the US is. So in a sense, it's very hard to be like, okay, step aside. We're going to do this on our own.
Like, even the United States in the end needs trade partners. It needs to talk to it needs to talk to other people elsewhere in the world and engage with them. They can't just keep on selling the tech products to each other and whatever. There has to be some kind of engagement. Fundamentally, at the end, like it's not clear kind of how much work can be done where everybody else agrees, okay, we're going to carry on like this, and the extent to which the United States has to progress along those lines. Because fundamentally, this is debt that is owed by these nations to companies in the United States. If they decide not to pay, that's that. There are obviously big problems. I don't wish to sound naive and suggest that it's as simple as, oh, well, we're just not going to pay our debts and there won't be any problems. Obviously, there will. But sooner or later, these countries can come together and say, we as a group have decided that we wish to restructure. And the power in the end rests with the majority of the people. It's a very uncertain, unprecedented situation. We've never been in this environment before.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, debt is held by private creditors mainly, right? So it's also just like, do we need to talk to the US in order to figure out whether or not debt restructuring is going to work, or do we need to talk to private investors and ask them, are you, still willing to participate? And, can that go through the IMF without necessarily the US government participating in an official agreement? Which this might be a chance to do. Like Seville might be a chance to have those conversations.
Yeah, fundamentally, I think if the private creditors are going to be asked to take a haircut on the debt, or a reduction on the amount of capital that they're going to receive, somebody has to compel them to do it. And most of them are based in the United States. And therefore, the United States is going to be the government that has the power to compel these individuals to take that reduction. But there's also a kind of unionization element here. If everybody else agrees that they are not going to pay, then these private creditors are powerless to enforce the agreement.
Mm.
So
I wonder if everybody else believes they have the power to do this. I think that might be the sticking point.
I think perhaps the problem, like, we're getting into a subject here in international law and international realpolitik, which none of us are quite expert enough to discuss properly, I think. But if everybody agrees that the rules exist in a certain way, then the rules exist in a certain way, because rules only exist in the heads of human beings. And if 95% of the human beings on the planet agree that these are the rules, the other 5% have to go along with it, whether they like it or not. In any case, but reaching a consensus and an agreement there, I think, is probably the tricky bit. Okay, so Rumi, you talked a little bit about how at WHA there are opportunities to progress further because the United States had kind of removed itself from the room. Do you think this is something we're going to see again going forward?
So I'm not sure about that. If it was exactly an opportunity to progress further because the United States had taken itself out of the room, but I think certain arguments that the United States held onto were probably not as prominent. But then you also have to understand that a lot of the divisions that happen within the global health space are between low-income countries and higher-income countries. And you still have representatives, like you'd still have representatives from the EU, for example. So take, for example, something along the lines of technology transfer when it comes to producing like pharmaceutical products, etc. Low-income countries want high-income countries to commit to being able to provide that tech transfer so that low-income countries can produce their own commodities. High-income countries will obviously want to protect the pharmaceutical industries that are based within them. So that applies to countries like Germany as well as like Switzerland and the United States. So removing the United States doesn't necessarily like take away all those challenges that still exist, but I think it takes away a really strong voice that's advocating for something in particular, but they still exist voices that support that.
Yeah. I think the United States has signed almost fewer treaties than almost anybody else in the last decade or more. It's likely to be the lone holdout in any number of situations. And it's been such a powerful voice that it can just do whatever it wants. Now, obviously, losing the money that the United States brings is hugely problematic for everybody, for the institutions and for the individuals who relied on the aid and whatever. But you do, on the other hand, hear a voice of people saying, well, okay, now we can talk to each other. Now we can get things done. We don't have to do what the US tells us. Do we think that there are opportunities to move that conversation forward a little bit in FFD and future conferences, whilst the United States has said we're just not going to be in the room?
I definitely think that that we could end up seeing a bunch of other countries say, okay, let's have a serious conversation about this because now we can. But it's unclear exactly what role the US is going to play at FFT right now because I do think they're still going to be in the room.
Mm.
We were able to see some documents for FFD outcomes, just like, draft documents showing which country wants what, redlined kind of here we want to remove this paragraph, we want to add this. And the US was part of that process. So I do wonder if the danger is like, kind of having one foot in, one foot out, where they still need to be negotiated with and they're still kind of there and they still want to be involved, but they're just going to be even less helpful and even less interested in actually coming to some kind of consensus. Again, it's hard to tell right now. It sounds like WHA, they didn't actually have, you said they didn't have someone there. They had like a video, right?
Yeah. So they didn't participate at all, just played us a video.
Yeah. So we might, I don't think they're going to just not participate at all in FFD. And I think that could potentially be a little bit more difficult.
All right. Well, I think we've drifted somewhat into the realm of airy speculation there, or certainly I have, and the other two of you have dragged me back to reality. So, with that in mind, let's wrap up there. That was an interesting discussion about kind of what the world of development might look like with the oversized influence of the United States kind of removed to an extent. And it's not clear at all how that might take us forward. So thank you very much to both of you. You've been listening to This Week in Global Development, and we hope you enjoyed it, and you'll join us again next week. Thanks so much.